Terminal services. In this nugget, we talk about terminal services. We start off by taking a quick overview of terminal services, but we don't spend a lot of time on that because at this level we already probably have some familiarity with it. But we'll also address certain terminal services components, several of which are new to Windows Server 2008. One thing you always have to have, regardless of the version, is the proper licensing for your terminal services licensing server, as well as the client access licenses. We'll also take a look here at accessing terminal services. How does this actually take place? Kind of what path does it follow to get from your desktop to a remote desktop in terminal services? Also, we take a look at a basic installation and configuration, and then we take a look at the terminal services session broker, which makes sure that connections are made in an equitable way. And then finally, we'll wrap things up with terminal services remote apps, which is a great way to use applications across the network without the user even realizing it. When you were growing up, did your parents ever tell you to stay away from certain things? Stay away from certain kids that could be a bad influence at school, or to never touch the stove, or don't play in busy streets, or don't smoke, drink, or chew, or go with girls that do. Any of those kinds of things. Yeah, some things it's good to stay away from. Something like my recent experience this past autumn to the Grand Teton National Park, where I ran into this guy. They look so cuddly and friendly from a distance. This was a bear that I stumbled across quite by accident, actually, and he was just across a shallow brook from me. It was probably 20 yards away. And, of course, being a photographer, I had to take his picture. The only thing was, he seemed to get more and more interested in me as I sat there taking that picture. And I couldn't understand why that was, because further down this line here, there were some berries that I'm sure were more attractive than whatever I might have. And then it occurred to me, I had just eaten a peanut butter granola bar, and I'm sure that this bear smelled that granola bar, and I started to get a little bit nervous. And as is my custom, apparently, I go on these trips and I always take bear spray, and inevitably I leave it in the car. Anyway, of course, bears have an acute sense of smell, and he started to lift his snout into the air and kind of sniff over in my direction. And I didn't realize this, but a park ranger had come up about 20 yards over on my left and said, "You need to go now." So I quickly departed. Anyway, yeah, some things we need to stay away from, and that can actually be a good thing, because we don't always want to have everything directly on our own desktops, for example. Sometimes it might be good to have users' environments farther away on some distant server somewhere, so that we don't have to manage and maintain all of their desktop applications and their operating system and all of these kinds of things. We can make our lives much, much simpler by using terminal services. So what are some of the advantages of having terminal services? And of course, this will be a little bit review because at this level, you already know something about terminal services and may have worked with it. But as a quick review, one of the main things is it can reduce your deployment cost, and I should also say your maintenance cost. Because what happens with this is you install terminal services on an existing server. You can turn, in Windows Server 2008, you can turn on desktop features so that users will even be able to have the same visual experience that they would have on Windows Vista machines, or at least pretty close to it. And that way it won't look like they're working on a server. They'll have, the fancy little Fisher-Price kind of color schemes and all of these things, if you want to allow that. So they can have an existing desktop operating system where they currently are. Maybe they're on Windows 2000. But we don't want to buy the licenses for, a whole bunch of new Windows Vista machines. We don't want to upgrade all the hardware for all those machines. We want to stay with minimal hardware. So we want to also save ourselves a great deal of effort in the planning and implementation and rollout and upgrade of Windows 2000. We want to stick with what we have because all of those things are significantly taxing to an IT department. Another thing we want to make sure that we have is a consistent environment, and we get that with terminal services as well, because we can configure your terminal server so that it has the same environment variables, it has the same exact applications, and you're constantly aware of exactly what's on that terminal server, and you don't have to chase down this user that has version 1 of an application and this user that has version 1.1 of an application, and there's something between the two that is inconsistent or incompatible or that causes other problems. And now, because of consistency problems, you have a higher IT maintenance cost. So you can really simplify your maintenance by keeping your consistency through all of these things and by significantly reducing the kinds of deployments you have to do. The same thing would apply, by the way, not only to your operating systems, but also to your software. What if the next great version of Microsoft Office comes out? Well, we don't want to have to go to each desktop and install the next version of Office. Instead, what we can do is to just upgrade or install on our terminal server, and anybody that makes that RDP connection to my terminal server automatically, of course, gets that edition of Microsoft Office. And then there's application compatibility. This is a big issue for the 70-647 exam. What we want to have here is terminal services. Of course, you can run it so that it gives you a complete desktop. It's much like what I'll see here. I'll just show you as a quick example here. Here I've got an installation that I finished. I can't even remember all of what I did here. But anyway, I made a remote desktop connection to this server. Well, you can do the same kind of a thing for users. Even though this is a server right now, with a terminal server, the users get a conventional kind of a desktop, and they get a start menu with programs that you've put on there for those users. So they get their entire environment over a remote desktop protocol connection, and it's also going to be a lot less bandwidth requirement than if we were to access the application themselves over the network connection. Other things directly relating to application compatibility are, for example, maybe their application will not install directly or be compatible with whatever their current desktop operating system is, but it will install on the terminal server. Well, we could just use it from there. Or we could put any kind of shims or fixes or patches or whatever needs to be done on that application and that's on the terminal server that the users all access. And again, what that helps to avoid is me having to go to each individual user desktop and perform whatever trick that is that suddenly makes it compatible, or doing all the patches or fixes and all that kind of a thing. So very, very powerful capabilities and advantages for terminal services here. Now let's also take a look at some constituent parts of terminal services, or terminal services components. And there may be more than this, but these are the most items that are directly related to terminal services. One of the first items you'll have there is the terminal server itself, or a terminal services farm, which you'll usually make available by having multiple terminal services available through network load balancing. That's typically how it's available. And in the enterprise, of course, you're probably going to have one or more terminal services farms. Another thing you'll have in your terminal services components, and we'll be talking about a few of these things in more detail here as we go, but I'm just going to kind of cover the big bullets right now. One of the other components you'll have there will be a license server. Now, the license server is going to be necessary to track the client licenses, and of course they can be by user or by device, but that's one of the key elements that you'll have. You'll also have a terminal services gateway, and this is what's going to allow your internet-based hosts to be able to connect to terminal services inside of your network. When they make the connection through terminal services gateway, they need to go past, first of all, terminal services cap and wrap. And what in the world is that? TS cap is connection authorization policy, and wrap is a resource authorization policy. And this is just a way of governing who gets to connect and what they get to connect to. And I'll talk about that as well as we go. There's also the terminal services session broker. This is going to be a great way to make sure that users reconnect to the appropriate terminal services if they've become disconnected in the past. It's also a good way to make sure that you have good load balancing. And then there's a new feature here also with Windows Server 2008 called Terminal Services Easy Print. This is kind of ingenious, actually. In the past, what's happened is if users had wanted to print to a certain printer, well, you have to have all of the drivers installed there on the terminal server. And this could get to be quite complicated in terms of an enterprise's entire print mapping. You can have a lot of different printer drivers for a lot of different situations for people that are connecting. Well, what happens now with TS Easy Print is that all that happens is when the user tries to print through a terminal services session, is it compiles an XML file which is actually transmitted back to the user side of things, and then the user actually makes the print job on their own computer. So this makes it much, much easier to maintain print management on our terminal services. And then we have the Windows System Resource Manager, which is another item that is very useful for terminal services in making sure that we appropriately load balance and use our resources. And this is not really load balancing between multiple terminal servers. It's mostly to make sure that on a given terminal server, each user gets an equal share of the resources. So if I have one user that connects and they use an application that's very CPU intensive, and they're using that application and everybody else is starving because of it, well, we can make sure that it's a little bit more fair using WSRM. Now let's start off here by getting into a little bit more detail about the Terminal Services Licensing Server. Of course, we have to have a client access license in order to be able to make a terminal services session. So what happens with this is, however, your Windows Server 2008 terminal server will communicate with a terminal services licensing server. Here's the key, and this is important for the 70-647 exam objectives. I would keep this in mind. A Windows Server 2008 terminal server will communicate only with the Windows Server 2008 licensing server. So, if you've got a Windows 2008 terminal server, but you haven't upgraded your licensing server to Windows Server 2008 yet, maybe it's a W2K3, Windows 2003 server, then it will not be able to properly communicate with it at all. And you could get into a situation where your licenses start to expire because they can never be confirmed. So if that's the case, and you're confronted with a scenario like that, you must upgrade your Windows Server 2003 terminal services licensing server to Windows Server 2008. And then the terminal services licensing server, it's going to be automatically detected. That's auto-detected. That's an ED there. It looks kind of weird, but it's an ED by the client and by the server. So you don't have to create some kind of a custom policy or write some kind of an elaborate script to point it to the right licensing server, anything like that. Just automatically detected. It's very easy, actually. And then your clients do require a client access license. If they don't have a client access license, they do have a 90-day grace period where they can make connections. And Microsoft does that kind of on purpose so that organizations can test out terminal services, see if they like it. Once they get warmed up to it and hooked on it, then Microsoft insists that you pay them money for the licenses. Of course, that's the business they're in. They are there to make a profit, obviously. Anyways, you do have a 90-day grace period. The server itself, you don't have to license it particularly either or activate it, but you do have 120 days with the terminal server before you have to activate its terminal services capability. And more specifically, before you activate the terminal services licensing server. Okay, the licensing server has 120 days. This is different than the normal activation for the system, for the operating system. Okay, you could have an activated operating system, but an inactive licensing server. You have to activate that within 120 days. And then the kind of licensing you have can be for per device or per user. This is very similar to other kinds of licensing schemes that you may have worked with in the past. Per device simply means that, let's say I've got some kind of a pocket PC device or a Windows mobile device, as they're called now, and maybe I've got a couple of laptops and a desktop. Well, that's 4 devices total, so I might need 4 total licenses if I work with multiple devices. That might not be practical per se. Probably a more popular usage is to do a per user. That means that my individual user could have 4 devices, but only needs 1 license because they're the same user that connects each time. It kind of just depends upon your environment. If you're in a kind of a kiosk type of an environment, or you're at one of those places where you have like, I don't know, a hot desk or hoteling workspaces where individual users don't have assigned computers, this would be like maybe a nurse's workstation in a hospital where multiple users come up to use that one device. Well, for that one, you wouldn't want per user because you'd have to pay for each nurse every time they came on shift to be able to use that device. So in this case, you would use per device so that you license 1 license for the device, multiple users can access it. So again, just depends upon your context. Alright, so how do we actually access our terminal services sessions? One of the ways to do that is through the terminal services web access, and when you do this, it's going to install IIS. Then it points to the terminal server on which the web access is installed. So in other words, here's my server. It's got TS web access, and it points to the terminal server, which is all on the same computer. Terminal services web access cannot point to, however, another terminal server over here. If I want to use terminal services web access over here, I also have to install terminal services web access on this server here as well. Then we can also use the terminal services web gateway. Now, terminal services gateway, excuse me. Now, the advantage of this is that I don't have to open up additional ports because most circumstances you're going to have port 80 and 443 open already, right, on your firewalls, because you probably already want to allow access to your internal, or rather to your web server for your internet public and so forth. So with this, we don't have to open up port 3389 because normally port 3389, that's a UDP port, it has to be open for remote desktop connections. And a lot of administrators have been reluctant to do that in the past, to open up a firewall port for that. Because as a general security practice, you don't want to open up too many ports if you don't have to. You don't want to make your firewall look like Swiss cheese because it's so full of holes. Well, this is going to use port 443 instead, which is probably already open. Oops, 443. And that's what we use for our HTTPS connections, because this all takes place over an SSL connection when you connect through a terminal services gateway. All right, now the terminal services connection authorization policies, or CAP, identifies who can connect. We're going to see that in a little while. You can specify, for example, a security group of users that is allowed to make the connection. Then there's also the terminal services I never can get this acronym. Resource authorization policies. I keep wanting to say remote access policies. But it's resource authorization policies. And this identifies accessible resources. In other words, which terminal services the users can connect to. So the emphasis here is on who can connect. Here the emphasis is on what we connect to. So let's take a look at a scenario about how a connection could take place, and there's a number of different ways, but this is just one example. I've got my laptop here, and I'm opening up a web page. Maybe my TS Web Access web page or a link to it is available on a public internet web page that I can access. Okay, so I access it, and I tell it that I want to access, a web application of some kind through terminal services. Well, when I do that, it has to send it through terminal services gateway, and the gateway will then determine or actually create a secure connection, because it's going to use an HTTPS connection over SSL, and that's why I don't have to open up additional ports through my firewall. Then the gateway will then send the connection down through my terminal server farm to make the connection. Now, in between all of that, there's a number of different other interactions that could take place. Authorization takes place through Active Directory. I might have an IIS server in the mix somewhere that would give me a further level of security, or maybe this is an IIS server, for example. Remember, that's my Internet Authentication Server, which is useful as a firewall, and a proxy, and many other things. Then I might also have to send it through Network Access Protection. Maybe I need to confirm that my laptop hasn't picked up a virus, or that it's got the current virus definitions and other things. And we discussed NAP at a previous nugget here in this same series. So I just put this in here to identify that there could be other things in the middle of this that we also have to pass muster with. But otherwise, what will happen is we try to access a connection, our web page, through Terminal Services Web Access. To actually make the connection, we have to go through the gateway, which then will establish this in an HTTPS connection, and then it will make our connection to our terminal server farm. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at how we would configure terminal services. Now, I'm just going to take you through the role real quick here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through it next, but I'm not going to click Finish and actually do it, because I've already done it on a different server. That way we'll save a little bit of time, because everything's already been pre-configured there. What you'll do is you'll simply click Add Roles, like you see I've done here, and choose Terminal Services. And from here you can see the various items that you can select from, all of which we've already talked about. The Terminal Services server itself, Terminal Services licensing, Session Broker, which we haven't talked in detail about yet, but we're coming up on that after a while here. Terminal Services Gateway, which also requires IIS. This is relative to the fact that, remember, that it's going to use an HTTPS connection to be able to make your connection there. Actually, I do need to click Add on that one. And then we also have the Terminal Services Web Access, which of course also requires a web page, therefore IIS is necessary for that one as well. And then you simply click on Next, and as you click on Next through the introductory pages here, you can require network level authentication or not. This is going to be the more secure version, and any current versions of the remote desktop client will be able to use this method. So I recommend the top one if possible. If you have any older clients that do not support that, you'd have to choose the bottom option. Here we can also specify the license mode that we're going to use. We can say configure later if we want to try to make up our mind later, and you can configure it after this point if you want to, but if you already know, you can choose per user or per device or something like that. I'll just choose configure later for the time being. And then you specify which groups you want to be able to allow to connect to the server. And what actually happens here is anybody that you add into this, for example, by default, administrators is added in. You can't remove that one. And everyone is added in as well. And that's generally what you would assume would happen because terminal services are pretty usually broad and allowed for anybody to access. But if that weren't the case, I would, of course, then remove this and add some other group. I'm okay with what we've got for the time being, though. And then for the discovery scope for terminal services licensing, we're not in a work group, so the first option is not available. If I have terminal services farm and I'm dedicating it to this particular domain, I would leave it at this domain. I could have a terminal services license server that would service the entire forest, and this would include multiple farms in other domains. So it just depends on the scope that you need. It doesn't really matter for my purposes too much, so I'll just leave it at the domain level. Maybe then you'd buy a certificate or you'd get one from your CA. So you can do that. I'll just do that for the time being. Then you click on Next, and you specify which authorization policies we want for Terminal Services Gateway. And closely associated with TS Gateway is the TS Cap and TS Wrap that we talked about earlier. I'm going to go ahead and configure those now. You can postpone that if you want to. But as I click on Next, here I'm going to specify the users that connect through the Terminal Services Gateway. And I can use administrators, and if I want everyone, I could do that one as well. Actually, I'm going to have to use domain users because that's a special group, so it would be like domain users, for example. So we have that, or whoever else it is that you want. Then as we click on Next, we enter in the name. I've already specified who can connect, so I just enter in a name right here, and this is somewhat arbitrary. You can put in whatever you want. And then, of course, you can also specify whether they can use a password only, or a smart card only, or both. And if you select both of these items, then either method is possible for the user. I'll just leave it at password for the time being. Then we have the remote access policy item, or rather I keep saying that with wrap. Remember, it's actually Terminal Services Resource Authorization Policy. And then we have to enter in a name for that one as well, and that's fine. And then what we specify is we can allow users to connect to only to computers in the following group. And then we can browse for that. Now, in Active Directory, I've already created a group. And I think I've got it over here. Terminal servers, excuse me. So I've created a group there. In the membership of that terminal services item, I've already added in TS1 and TS2. So I should be able to find here then, on the wrong computer here, let's go to this other one. I should be able to find then, if I click on Browse, that group. So I'm going to say Terminal, I think that's enough there, Terminal Servers. And there we have it. Then we go ahead and click on Next, and then we'll identify any network policies that we want to implement. We talked about that in a previous nugget, so I'm going to kind of quickly bypass that one for the time being. Notice that, again, there it'll show the network policy server. Other things that could play a role in your terminal services item but are not directly connected to us right now, I'm going to go ahead and leave behind. Then we have IIS. Again, this is not directly related to terminal services, except that we need to have it for things such as our terminal services web access. But I'll go ahead and click on Next past all of these items as well. Also remember, we had to have that for our terminal services gateway. Now, again, those are the steps that you go through to install all of it. Normally, you're not going to install all of those things on a single server, and of course, I canceled it for the time being. Normally, you don't install all those on one server. In our case, I did just so that I have a central location to show you all of the different items. And those have all now been configured in advance over on Terminal Services 2, or ts2.nuggetlab.com, which I'll show you after a bit here. Now, if you've looked at some of the other series for Windows Server 2008 here at CBT Nuggets, you'll see that we have some other titles that go into great depth on configuring all the aspects of terminal services and all the checkboxes and how to exactly configure every little item. For the 70-647 exam, we're not really concerned with every little radio button, checkbox, and drop-down list so much as we are of knowing what the constituent parts do and using the proper tool to get an objective done for the exam purposes. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the key components. One of those is the Remote App Manager. I'm going to come back to that. It's actually pretty cool, but I'll give that a little bit more time to percolate here, and instead I'm going to go right to the Gateway Manager, because we talked about that recently. Now notice that if I go here to the TS2, which is the local server also, and I right-click on this and choose Properties, that I can specify the number of connections that are going to come in. I can also disable any new connections. Why would I want to do that? Well, that might be useful if this particular server needs to come down for maintenance for some reason, or we install an update that requires a reboot, then I'll disable new connections and I'll kind of drain existing connections. So there might be a few people still connected. I'll give it a day or so until they've all ended their connection. And if they haven't, I can send them a message and tell them they're about to be disconnected. But that would be one item that you could do. Here's the certificate. Remember that to use Terminal Services Gateway, it's going to use an SSL connection over HTTPS. So you can't do that kind of a connection unless you have a certificate, which I have already created a self-signed certificate here. And then, of course, we have the CAP store. And this is where we identify, among other things, whether or not we're going to require the clients to send a statement of health. This relates to a previous nugget that we talked about, where we can use a network policy server and use things such as network access protection. And you can specify whether it's this local server or some other central server. Then we have our server farm. Now, I haven't actually done all of this yet, but I want to show you something here briefly. Let me just minimize my remote desktop connection, because this will not work unless you first configure DNS properly, and that is something that you'll want to make sure you do. Now, I've already done this in advance. Let me make a little more space here. Notice that I have A records for my TS1 and TS2. And of course, I never finished TS1, but we'll just assume that they're both, active terminal services servers. Now, I don't want to leave them that way if I'm going to use a farm. So what I did was I right-clicked and I chose New Host A or AAAA record, and then I entered in farm1, just like this, farm _1, and then I entered in the IP address 10.10.10. And let's just say I have a 79 or something like that, and then I add that host. Okay, now what that does is it's going to give me round robin between all of these different servers at these different IP addresses, because they have the same name, but round robin is going to be used so that each one will sequentially come up as the next one in line to accept a connection. I'm going to delete this one because I don't actually have a server by that IP address. But that's how that works. Now, once I've configured that, then when I go back in here to my server farm item, it'll be resolvable. So you have to have that DNS item configured first. So I have farm_1.nuggetlab.com, and I'll click on Add. If I don't have that already in DNS, it'll give you a big red X there. So then I've got it, and the reason why it says unsaved is because I haven't actually clicked OK yet. Okay, but if you do that, then of course it'll take. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on Apply. And there it is. Okay, it says OK. So we're OK with that one, all right? It just kind of double checks through everything and makes sure it's all OK. You can identify what kinds of things are audited here as well. But basically, this is the most of the items that you'll need to know about in terms of these gateway manager items. Okay, you want to point it to a server farm, and you can, of course, add multiple farms so that the gateway can point to multiple farms, but we're OK with what we've got right there. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at another item here as well. So you can see it here in a moment. But right now I only have one item in this. This is kind of similar to the old remote access policies that we used to run in Windows Server 2003, in that you might have multiple criteria and you have to match at least one of these in order to be able to make a connection. I've only got one here for simplicity's sake, but if you take a look at it as I double click on it, I just named it an arbitrary name. That's actually what got filled in automatically, and I accepted it. And then I enter in the requirements as well. Here I specify that we only need a password. Okay, remember, this is similar to what we saw in the wizard when we first set this all up. I can change that in this interface to choose password and/or smart card. And then the user group membership. I put in domain users and administrators. I probably didn't actually have to have administrators, but it was there by default. And the reason why I wouldn't technically have to have them is because anybody that's a member of administrators will also, of course, be a member of domain users. So it's a little redundant, but it doesn't hurt anything either. Then you can, of course, enter in computer group memberships here as well, so that you can only allow connections from certain computers. Maybe I have a kiosk set up where I only want to have my kiosk machines making terminal services connections. Well, then I would add whatever security group those computers are a member of here, and only they would be able to make that connection. And then down here, this is kind of handy because this does get confusing. But here it will give you a summary of everything, and it'll tell you what criteria that you must meet in order to be able to make a connection. And if you meet all of these, then it will allow the user to connect to the terminal services gateway. Then you can also identify the device redirection, and you can identify that you can have devices, clipboard items, and so forth that you see down through here redirected to the user's local desktop. for which we can enable or disable them. For example, I might want to disable device redirection for something like certain drives or something like that. And why would I want to do that? Well, it could be that I'm connected from an insecure location. I'm connecting from a coffee shop to a terminal services connection. But I have confidential files on a server back at work in the terminal services connection that I can access. I could save them to my home directory or something like that. But maybe I could also save them to a thumb drive on my local laptop in the insecure Wi-Fi at the coffee shop. Well, if that's the case, then now I've taken that confidential document out of my terminal services connection to a physical local location where if I forget to pick up the USB flash drive after when I leave the coffee shop, or if I'm in an insecure location where someone is able to hack that Wi-Fi network and grab the data, well, that could be a problem. So you might want to disable certain items that you would not want to be available there. And then we have our resource authorization policies as well, which is where we identify which servers they can make a connection to. If we double click on this, we'll see that again this policy is also enabled and these users can connect, but the idea here is which computer group do we want to allow the users to make a connection to. Okay, so let's move this over to the side. The connection authorization policies relate to who can connect more than anything. The resource authorization policies relate more to what they can connect to, although user groups are here also. This emphasis here is on what they can connect to. And in advance, I had already created a security group called Terminal Servers. I think I showed you that earlier. And since I added them in here, well, then we can make that connection to any computer that's a member of that Terminal Services security group. And then, of course, there's the most important parts of these policies here under the Gateway Manager. And then, of course, there's also monitoring if you want to keep track of what's going on. Let's go ahead and take a look now at the licensing. And this is actually fairly simple. This is also where we can configure things such as what kind of security to use within the connection, what level of encryption, whether or not we want to use FIPS, for example, which is the Federal Information Processing Standard, those sorts of things. And then there's our licensing here as well. If you take a look down here, you can double-click on one of these to further configure that. So, for example, when I double-clicked on that, brought up the licensing where we're using per user, and you can also, of course, choose per device. We automatically discover the license server, which is, of course, the best way to go in most circumstances, but you can also specify existing licensing servers here if you want as well. Now, this is not related only to licensing because there's other things here as well, such as the Terminal Services Session Broker. Notice that there's not really a Terminal Services Session Broker node over here on the left-hand side. What I can do in order to edit that is to double-click directly on this item as well. It takes me to the same, actually this is the same dialog box, it's just that the focus is on the TS Session Broker instead of the licensing, which I just showed you. So over here, we can join a farm in the Terminal Services Session Broker, and we can specify which server it is that's joining the farm. It's going to be TS2. It's going to join farm_1, which I've already identified previously. And this is kind of cool. I can participate in Session Broker load balancing. I'll see that in a whiteboard here with you here shortly, but let's talk about what that's relative to. Actually, let me just show you the whiteboard now because that'll make it all easier. So here we go. Let's talk about the Session Broker. What we can do is to distribute requests between terminal services in a farm. What's going to happen is if all other things are considered equal, let's just say I've got two servers in the farm, and let's say that this server here has 15 connections already, and this one has, well, I don't know, let's say 18 connections already. The Terminal Services Session Broker will look at inbound connections and it'll say, okay, which one has the fewest connections? Well, 15 obviously. So the next inbound connection is going to make a connection for this user to that particular Terminal Services server. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and take a look at another scenario that could pop up here, however. This user, they're at the airport when they're making this connection, but then they got to get on a flight, so they just click on the X in the upper part of the connection. So they would just click right here, this X right up here. Well, that would leave everything open. For example, if they were an administrator and they were administering all of this, this dialog box would be open. If it was a generic user and they had, I don't know, PowerPoint open or whatever else, well, that application would still be open and potentially files would not yet be saved. So, when they close the X, all of that stuff is still left open. What I don't want to happen is that when I land the airplane, I land and I'm in a different city and I open up my laptop again to reconnect, I don't want to start a new connection over here because, my PowerPoint session was open over here, my unsaved files are all over here, everything I already had going on is over here. So what happens is the terminal services session broker identifies whether or not we already had a pre-existing condition, a pre-existing condition, and if it does, it will reject your health insurance. Anyway, a pre-existing session. And if we did, it'll just reconnect us to that pre-existing session, even if these numbers are different. So if it was 15 here and 18 here, even though this would have more connections at this point, since I'd already been previously connected, it will reconnect me now. I can also control the distribution according to the hardware. Let me clean up my chicken scratch up here and start over with that. Now, let's say that this one has 2 processors, 4 gigs of RAM. Okay. This one has 4 processors, 8 gigabytes of RAM. Now, ideally for your terminal services farms, you want your servers to be identical hardware, just to make things easier to manage and predict in terms of the total load that they're going to receive. That's not always practical, however, because we don't always start with server farms from scratch. So these are not equally powerful. Now, if I don't manage this somehow, then it's just going to load balance these based on the number of connections. But this one, of course, is only half as capable, so to speak, as this one is. So what I can do is I can control the distribution according to hardware, and you assign a certain weight to these. So by default, it has a weight of 100. So if that one has a weight of 100, then I might set this one up to a weight of 50. Then this one would receive twice as many connections as this one, and then this one might have 10 connections, and this one would only have 5 connections, for example. Okay, so that's what that's all about. As I mentioned earlier as well, if you've got a disconnected session, then you reconnect. It'll reconnect you to the same server, and the weighted values are available to help distribute the requests right there. And that's where this is done. So here's where we would set the relative weight of this server, TS2, in this farm. You know what, also let me talk to you about this down here. To use IP address redirection, and it says it's recommended. What's that about? Well, what happens here is when the client is disconnected, and instead of logging off, they disconnect again. That's where they click the X up here. Well, then it needs to make a reconnection to the same server that they connected to in the first place, as I just discussed. What happens here is it will do that by the IP address that the client last used. And this is only useful if the client is able to address the terminal server directly by IP address. And this is going to be the case if you're using the terminal services session broker load balancing using DNS round robin, and that's what we're using here, or you're using network load balancing, or you have some kind of a hardware load balancer that doesn't support terminal services session broker routing tokens. Okay, so under all circumstances that I've discussed here, and in my current context, this is what I would be using. If I clear that item, then what's going to happen is it's going to use terminal services session broker routing tokens instead. And what those are is it's a token that is saved to the client when they make the disconnection, and it identifies in the token what the IP address is of the terminal server that they had connected to previously. And then, of course, it will make a reconnection to the IP address in that token. Now, of course, we talked about terminal services session broker as a way of distributing the load between terminal servers. Another thing that you can take a look at, though, with that would be something that's not directly related to terminal services, and that's a feature that you can add. Let me just go to features real quick over here. And if I click on add features, you'll notice that there is an item here called, if I can find it, Windows System Resource Manager. What that's useful for is, and you have to add the Windows internal database for that, but what that's useful for is that it allows me to distribute how my system resources are distributed to various applications that run. So, for example, in a terminal services context, what if I had one user that used an application on the terminal server that required heavy CPU utilization? Maybe it's very processor intensive. Well, when that user connects, all the other users that are trying to use a terminal services session suffer because their performance suddenly drops dramatically. So it's not quite fair. So what you could do is to use WSRM to configure that application to be able to use a certain amount of processor utilization. It doesn't really kick in until at least 70% of the utilization has been absorbed, and at 70% and beyond, then it will start to throttle that utilization to that given user that's using that application. Thereby giving everybody else more of a fair shake with the resources on the terminal server. And this, which I have just described to you about WSRM, is something that I would definitely keep in mind as a potential exam objective item to remember. So remember, WSRM can control the resources that an application uses and make it more equally distributed for your other clients. Again, it only kicks in after 70%. Now here I've quickly switched over to my domain controller where I've already installed WSRM, but just quickly here, to install it you go to Features. It's not a role, it's a feature. You click Add Features. You can see here that I've already installed it because it appears down here under my list of installed features. So where do you think you administer this feature of Windows System Resource Manager? You're thinking, well, duh, James, it's a feature, so you just click on the little plus next to Features. Well, how about that, smarty pants? You see there? It's not there at all. This is what Microsoft does to baffle us continually, is they put stuff where you would not expect to see it. It's actually going to be under Diagnostics. Even though I installed it as a feature, it appears under Diagnostics, and there's Windows System Resource Manager. I'll connect to this computer, for example, just to show you. But then what you do is you can specify when you want it to be able to manage those resources. You might not want it to manage those resources 24/7. It might only be during certain times of peak utilization or something like that. But that's where you would administer this, and that's what I wanted to show you there. Alright, let's talk here about the Terminal Services Remote Application Manager. What this is going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to run an application through Terminal Services, but it doesn't look like it is. The application is actually going to be on my terminal server, but it looks local. It's going to have its own window, and I don't have to establish a full desktop session. Now, how do I get this to work, and how do I make it available to the clients? Well, I have to be able to distribute it in one of three ways. Number one, you can create an RDP file for it, and then you can put that RDP file on a centrally located file share, for example. Then you can create a shortcut for that on each user's desktop or in their environment. Now, we don't really talk about this in the 70-647 exam, but just as a quick side note to that, to make shortcuts available is actually easier than it used to be. I'm going to go to just a generic unlinked policy that I have here and show you how that can be done. This can be done under Preferences. This is not really part of the exam objectives for, I don't think any of the Windows Server 2008 exams right now, because this came out after the exam objectives were written. But what we have here is something that we can now use as something called Group Policy Preferences. And with these, just as a quick item, you can set up different things here, such as these items that you see here, that were not previously available in our conventional policies. One of the things we could do is to create a shortcut, and I could choose New Shortcut, and I could simply then point this to the target, and I would point it to the location, the target path here, wherever my file share was for the RDP connection that I create. Now, we don't need to really administer that beyond what I just showed you, but I want to show you that that is available. The other thing I could do is I could create an MSI file and then deploy that MSI application as a conventional group policy distributed application, okay, or GPSI, Group Policy Software Installation. Then I can also use Terminal Services Web Access. So those are my three methods. Let's go ahead and go back and create an application, first of all, that we can make available for this. Here under Terminal Services Remote App Manager, I don't have anything yet. If I did, they'd appear down here. So I'm going to go to Add Remote App Programs. Then, of course, the wizard starts up, and I'll just click on Next. And here's where you simply select any applications that you already have installed. If you don't see it here, you can browse for them, but I'll just click, Calculator. How about the photo gallery? Let's do that. Okay, so then I'll go ahead and click on Next and Finish. Now I have two applications here, but nobody has any way of accessing these yet. They actually would appear through the web page, but otherwise I have to create an RDP file or a Windows installer package. So let's go ahead and select one of these. Let's select the calculator, and I'm going to create an RDP file. So I simply click on the little link, which starts yet another wizard, and this is pretty easy. I'm just going to browse to my desktop to make it simple. I'll just click OK. You don't have to type in a file name or anything. You just tell it the location, and it'll name this RDP item according to whatever the executable is, or whatever the application is that we're looking for. Once I click on Finish, notice that it creates this calc item right here for us. Let me just go ahead and I'll cut that out in just a moment. I'm going to create another one, though, first. I'm going to create a Windows installer package for the second one, and I'll click on Next here as well. And this one I'm also going to put just on the desktop for ease of access for the time being. Next, Finish. That's pretty much it. All there is to it. Now I've got both of those available right here. Now I'm going to go ahead and take those, and I'm going to cut those out, and I'm going to put them on a file share over on my server. That's in my temp directory here over on DC Nugget 1. Let me make sure I copy those, by the way. I don't think it took, so let me copy. And then go back over to that. So it's in my temp directory, and I'll just paste them right in here. Okay. Now there they're both located. Now let's see how we can go about distributing these items now. One thing I could do is over on this server, which is where I am right now, I can access the file share that I just dropped those into. And as I go to the temp directory, there's my calc.rdp. I could just use policies or like the preferences that I showed you earlier. I could just use those to distribute a shortcut. I took the whole file out. I meant to take a shortcut, so I'm going to create a shortcut. That would be kind of the equivalent of doing that. Now notice what happens when I double click on this shortcut. I could do this from a 2000 machine, an XP machine, any machine. Double click on it. Here it's going to say that I have an unknown publisher. Normally the user is not going to see that as long as the certificate that's associated with this terminal server is a trusted certificate. Since this one's self-signed, it's not trusted. So I'm going to have to manually choose connect in this particular case, but I'll just say, don't prompt me again. But otherwise, it's pretty transparent. Once this starts up, I'm going to then see the calculator. And there it is, voila. Now there's no difference between this calculator here and one that I would launch locally, not in a visual sense anyway. I can play a shell game. Which one's the local one? Which one's the remote desktop connection one? Take a guess, which one? There's no way of really knowing any difference between these two. So it's pretty cool in terms of the transparency to the user, and all they have to do is double click a shortcut and voila, there it is. Okay. All right, let's take a look at the other one. That would be my Windows Photo Gallery item. Let me just go ahead and quickly create a group policy item for that. I'm just going to do this, whiz bang, real quick. We've already worked with policies in the past, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But as I go into this, I'm going to just create a policy. Let's make it for the domain. Create a GPO and link it. I'm going to say distribute, MSI for TS. Okay, Photo Gallery. Okay, I'm not very creative today, so I'll just type it that way. And then we'll just go ahead and edit this item. And then we're going to go ahead and distribute this application maybe to all computers, for example. So I'll go ahead in here to Software Settings, Software Installation Packages. And I'm going to browse for that location. Remember, for this kind of thing, you want to do this through the network. You don't want to do this through the local file system. So I'm going to, otherwise, the clients will all look for the same resource on their own local file system. Okay, I'm turning on Network Discovery to make these things available. So then I'll go to DC Nugget 1, Temp, and then there's my Windows Photo Gallery item. I'm going to go ahead and assign that. We'll see it pop up here, and then I'm going to go ahead and refresh policy. Which we've looked at all of this stuff in a previous nugget, so I'm not going to take a lot of time with that. Now, what I need to do is, since this is a computer-based item, it is going to require that I restart the computer. Once I've restarted the computer, we'll come back in, and we'll see that this is now available on the Start menu. Alright, here I've rebooted the server. The software did install itself, at least I think it did. I haven't actually checked. Maybe I should have done that before I started recording. But anyway, then what else has happened is, notice that there's no shortcut on the desktop for it. I do want to quickly show you that first as I go back here to our TS2 connection, which I've reconnected to. If I create a Windows installer package, by the way, you can also do that by a right click. If I create that Windows installer package, let me quickly go here. Notice that you can also specify a desktop shortcut when you do the installation if you want. I didn't do that, but you certainly can do that. In my case, it'll just appear under Remote Programs. There it is. Good. I guess it did install. And then there's the Windows Photo Gallery. Again, it's going to be indistinguishable from an actual physical desktop connection, other than the fact that you see that it's making a remote desktop connection that you saw there when it first made a start up with this. But here's actually the pictures that I took when I was in the Grand Tetons this past autumn. It was a beautiful trip. Let's do a quick show through this real quick, just kind of for fun. This guy charged me, by the way, this moose. You wouldn't expect that they would be very fleet of foot because they're kind of tall and lumbering, but those long legs are pretty powerful and they can run fast. I had to run into a bunch of reeds like a scaredy cat to get away from that guy. So anyway, beautiful scenery out there in the Grand Tetons this autumn, and if you ever get a chance to go, boy, it's a wonderful trip if you can get the opportunity. This is called Oxbow Bend right here, a very favorite location of photographers. Anyway, so a really good trip there, and as you can see, I got quite a few fun pictures. Okay, well, that's pretty much it. Now I close up that remote desktop connection, which again is just a remote application actually, and it again behaves just the same way any other application would. Oh, and one more thing before I forget. If you're presented with a scenario where some administrators might try to run an application itself, like the executable, over the network, that might work okay, but it's not really very practical because it's going to use a lot more bandwidth than an RDP connection, which is what was used for these applications that I just ran for you, the calculator and the photo gallery. But if an administrator tries to run just a normal application directly over the network, then it's going to use a lot more bandwidth. Also, for slow connections or for WAN links, it's not going to be practical at all because you're very likely to get RPC timeouts. And by the way, this is all important for the exam objectives. So you're likely to get RPC timeouts, especially over WAN links of great distance, so the applications would then fail. If that's the case, this is definitely a situation in which you want to use terminal services remote application because it uses RDP, which is optimized for low bandwidth, high latency scenarios. So this is going to be definitely much better. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to show you too. Sorry, I keep forgetting things. Believe me, you'll get it all before we're done. Here in the terminal services item, remember that we did have the web access installed. So if I go down here to terminal services down here, and if I right click on it and I choose to browse this, actually let me do it this way, I'll browse it this way. Then what we'll see here is a link for the web page that we can then copy and paste into our intranet web page with minor modifications because it'll say localhost. Got to give it a minute to show up. Apparently my web page to itself is performing slowly. How embarrassing is that? So we'll give that just a moment, and there it is. Okay. Now that's where I wanted to point out that these applications will also show up. So let me close this for a moment, and I'm going to go ahead and open up a browser here on a different machine. This is my server now. I'm just going to paste that in, but of course I'm going to substitute the actual name of the terminal server. So that was TS2, I think. And now we can actually see that if this were an intranet web page or if it had a link to this location, we could then again run the calculator. You can identify in this case what things you want to be connected. I'll just use that. Also my Windows photo gallery. I'll choose that one to connect that as well. And once again, we're now connected directly to those locations. So pretty fun in that respect as well, and easy to access. Again, those all took place over RDP. Again, with terminal services web access, I could also just simply choose remote desktop, and then you would enter in the connection here and any options that you wanted to configure as well. In this nugget, we talked about terminal services. We started off by talking about just a quick overview of terminal services and what some of the advantages are. We also took a look at the various terminal services components because there's a lot of parts there. There's the gateway servers, there's the authorization policies, there's all different kinds of things that are involved in this, licensing servers and the like. And when it comes to licensing, remember that you have to have your terminal services license server activated within 120 days, and you have to have client access licenses within 90. We also took a look at accessing your terminal services and the kind of different pathways that takes in order to get from your desktop to a remote desktop connection. And then we took a look at installing and configuring terminal services, at least in a basic sense. And then we configured some of those things that are more relative to the Windows Server 2008 exam purposes. We took a look also at the Terminal Services Session Broker, which is a great way to equitably distribute the load among your terminal services. And finally, we took a look at a really cool feature of terminal services called Terminal Services Remote Applications. And this, of course, is where we can access an application over RDP, and it looks like it's been launched from our